you talk about disestablishment being an amazing achievement when the Puritans had to submit against their will to a form of toleration. What struck me, and I want to believe you, is you say, though evangelicals have the great numbers in America, we remain an enlightened nation. Is that really true? And if it is, could you justify that?
Yes, one of the ways that the evangelicals have reached such numbers is because we are an enlightened nation. That is, Jefferson and Madison said that if you separate church from state, you will free religion. It will become more competitive, more pure, less trammeled by contamination with the state. And that certainly proved true. It was only after... See, the religious right has a myth that we began as a very religious country, and we've been getting less and less ever since.
Right.
Exactly the opposite of the truth. We were never less religious than at the founding period in the 1770s. 17% of people were churchgoers. After the adoption of the Constitution, the tremendous explosion, especially of Methodists, but also of Presbyterians and Baptists, took place. So even though we were strained out by our tremendous westward expansion, religious entrepreneur energies took over in a way that they would not have done under an established church. So even the evangelical side of this polarity profits by the enlightened side. And of course, the evangelicals admit a certain degree of separation of church and state. They say you should not have the establishment of a particular sect, but we should have an establishment of religion in general. Madison wouldn't have liked that, but even so, that's a step up for them. And the enlightened religion has admitted that it needs some kind of energies from the evangelical side. So it's neither the one nor the other. There's a shifting balance of preponderant enlightenment and evangelicalism, but they wouldn't exist without each other.
I can see how the evangelicals benefited from the Enlightenment, but you ask in an article in the New York Times, can a people that believes more fervently in the virgin birth than in evolution still be called an enlightened nation? And so there's a kind of tension there between the actual truth on the ground when we think of somebody like Stephen Prothero's book on religious literacy and so on, and the fact that you yourself, I think, writing a wonderful article also in the New York Times in describing Jesus as that really, from one point of view, wouldn't sound very enlightened. Jesus of the Gospels is not, you said, a great ethical teacher like Socrates, our leading humanitarian. He's an apocalyptic figure who steps outside the boundaries of normal morality to signal that the Father's judgment is breaking into history. He's sort of more a higher Nietzsche, you say, than a higher Socrates. Now, that for me, I mean, it's very refreshing, but I'm not sure how. I'm trying to work through, because when we get into detail in the book, how the one side feeds the other. It seems to me that yes, you can feel the balance, but they don't really appreciate each other, these two sides.
Well, they don't always. There are two questions there. What I was addressing in the thing on Jesus is that, of course, his breaking into history is not a matter of eschatology, but of contemporary fact, that he cuts across history right this minute with a believer. And when I was talking about the Enlightenment, is this an enlightened country, I was pointing to the extraordinary condition of our time right now, which I think is a passing phase. We've had three main phases of evangelical fervor, and they've been shorter in span each time, and I think this is going to be the shortest so far. So I think we are not in a very enlightened moment in our history,
right.
but that's not the same as saying we are not overall an enlightened nation.
So even the Great Awakening wasn't very long.
Well, no, that was very short, but that was before the Constitution. What I'm talking about is the polarity once the separation of church and state took place. You can't have a conflict between enlightened and evangelical religion until there's an enlightened religion. And that didn't exist at the time of the First Great Awakening. But at the time of the Second Great Awakening, that went on for about 30 years. Largely, I would argue, because it was self-fueling, self-funding, do-it-yourself religion. It didn't depend on government. There wasn't much government around, for that matter. There were more Methodist preachers
the national government.
than postal office workers. But that split up over slavery. The North and South read the Bible differently, and that discredited their unified thrust. The second period, which took place at the beginning of the 20th century, was the fundamentalist period. And unlike the first one, they did get government involved. They wanted government to tell people you can't drink liquor, you can't teach Darwin, you can't deliver mail on Sundays, etc. And that sets off alarm bells with Americans, because we do have a separation of church and state that gets at least lip service most of the time. And if you try to involve government, that gets them disturbed. So the crashing of prohibition and the Scopes trial, for instance, made it have a shorter life, about 20 years at the peak. Our current one, which is more intrusive of religion into politics than any in our history, is, I think, running out of steam, because people have very grave misgivings about the way the government has been used. To take one of many, many examples, when Terry Schiavo was taken up by the religious right as a kind of surrogate fetus to be kept alive at all costs, they ordered, in effect, the Congress and the administration interfere with the courts and tell them they can't do this. They can't allow withdrawal of the life support. And the Congress jumped to at this command and instantly passed a resolution which was also instantly declared unconstitutional. And the president, who hates to break up his vacations, came running back and got up in the middle of the night to sign the thing. And 81% of the people in an instant poll said this was wrong. And a great many Americans are having the reaction that came at a slower rate with the fundamentalists of the 20th century, that this is wrong. This is an interference of religion with government that should not take place. He promised, President Bush promised, a faith-based social concern. We got a faith-based medicine, faith-based science, right, faith-based war. And all of those things have led to a reaction not only among others outside the evangelical movement, but those within it. Senator Danforth and others, a whole group of moderate evangelicals are now speaking up, saying we can't let these people speak for us. On global warming, for instance, there's now an evangelical preserve God's creation movement.
So one of the things, though, that struck me about the book is that whichever both sides, the populist or evangelical and the Enlightenment side, it's very much a Protestant thing. And here you are, a Catholic, celebrating a Protestant thing. Where does Roman Catholicism fit in, or your version of it?
Well, I'm talking about the American culture through most of our history. And that was predominantly, for a long time, almost exclusively Protestant. I do, when it comes time, talk about Catholics and Jews in the 1930s beginning to affect the general culture. Up to that time, they had their own little enclaves, in which obviously they had a great influence on each other, but not something that reached out. They were excluded, and some of them excluded themselves because they had business of their own. The Catholics, for instance, had an attitude that they had to build their own little enclave, their own schools, their own parishes. For an immigrant church, it was going to be very difficult, had to raise a lot of money, and they didn't have time to fight the general culture. So it's the general culture that I'm talking about through most of the book. But then when the Jews and the Catholics come in the whole last part of the book, I say they succumb or adopt to the polarity of head and heart, because there are evangelical and enlightened Catholics and Jews.
So they split as well.
Yes. There's the same dynamic with them because they are Americans. So what happened in the general culture is being replicated in the microcosm.
Do you think there's still, though, a great deal of anti-Catholic prejudice, residual anti-Catholic prejudice in the United States?
It's rapidly dissipating, a lot less than when I grew up in the 1930s. And there's also, we should not talk about simply an anti-Catholicism. There was a Catholic attitude toward the outsider. You know, when I grew up, you couldn't go into a Protestant church. You thought of them as the other. There was this resistance. It was broken down largely by John F. Kennedy. But Paul Blanchard and others who had suspicions of Catholicism had a plausible case. You know, at that point, the Vatican had not yet given up its historic condemnation of democracy as an illegitimate form of government. So in effect, Kennedy had to say, well, if there is a clash, and there could be, I'll have to surrender the presidency. You know? So that was, but that has been broken down. One of the reasons for that is that prejudice in general has undergone a tremendous assault in the last few decades against women, against blacks, against Native Americans, against gays, against the handicapped. I have a chapter in the book called The Rights Revolution, in which all of these people who were excluded from our history have suddenly burst into it. Can I tell that little story about the Women's Caucus?
Absolutely, yes.
I went to the Bar Association meeting, the American Bar, in the early 90s, and there was a Women's Caucus meeting. There hadn't been a Women's Caucus shortly before that. Huge ballroom with all round tables, and before the formal addresses, the woman at the dais got up and said, would all you women out there who are the first woman to be an editor of your law school journal stand up? And then the first woman to be made senior partner in your firm. The first woman to start your own firm in your own little town. The first woman to be district attorney. First woman to be federal judge. First woman to be dean of a law school. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these women standing up. And this was a revolution that had taken place in their lifetime. The older people were the pioneers, the younger were the beneficiaries. And I thought at the time, if you change the relationship of man and woman, which hadn't been done, no one had taken it that seriously, the equality, you're changing society at its deepest nexus, the relation of husband to wife, of mother to children, of daughters to parents, of girls to siblings, female employers to employees, female employees to employers. That's changing society as deeply as you can possibly do. But, and of course that was going on not only in the law, but in business, journalism, medicine, the military, religious ministry. And it was not only that, it was part of the civil rights movement for blacks and for Native Americans. Well, that's an extraordinary change. And I think that it's important as a way of understanding the concerns of evangelicals. That's frightening to them. The family, the place of woman, the place of the father. And that's why they're so afraid of the modern world that they keep their children at home and homeschool them. Then they send them out of the homeschool into these Christian colleges. They've expanded the ones that existed and brought into being new ones, Patrick Henry and Ave Maria and Thomas More and Regents, because they can't let them out into this scary world. So I think